Today, we'll talk about how public service systems like healthcare, education, and social services can change. Given current crises like growing inequities and polarization, many argue that they need to change radically. I've called this talk relatively radical. And by bringing relative and radical together, I'm trying to catch the core of the argument I'm going to make. It's about how systems can change, sometimes in radical ways, through many people making small shifts in their everyday relations. From this argument, I'll propose a situated and relational approach to transforming these systems. But as this is a public lecture, I'll start by saying a few words about design research before digging into the lecture topic. While I can't do this briefly without oversimplifying things, I want to invite those of you not so familiar with this field into what we're going to talk about today. So, in my earlier life, I used to think about chairs or posters or iPhones when I heard the word design. But design can also be understood more broadly. So a much used definition comes from Herbert Simon, who describes design as courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. This means that design is a verb. When we intentionally make, shape, or adapt something to change situations, we are designing. It's an activity that we do as humans. So design research generates knowledge about, through, or for this activity. This means learning about how design can be done, for instance, by studying professional designers. It means exploring something, like a material, through the process of shaping it. And it means generating knowledge that aims to help people design in better ways. And often it involves all of the above. So while designing is a verb, design research also typically involves an object in focus, so something being designed. For instance, some studies are focused on the design of graphics, objects, and artifacts. Others are focused on designing the interactions between humans, machines, and technology. And some research explores how more intangible things, like services, like a healthcare service, can be designed, or even the patterns that organize these large, complex systems like the welfare state. So in addition to those different objects, the subject in focus, who is designing, also varies across the research. So many studies focused on professional designers and their particular way of reasoning and working. In some studies, professional designers are joined by others, for instance, those who will use what's being designed in designing together. And lastly, and maybe a smaller proportion of studies, focuses on what has been called diffuse design, exploring how people, organizations, and communities take action to change their situations into preferred ones. So these varying subjects and objects give rise to quite a broad array of studies. So they range from exploring how professional designers can improve everyday kitchen equipment, to how workers can take part in democratizing the design of data equipment in workplaces, to how co-design teams can use cards and visuals to improve services, and to how communities in mountain areas can shape their local businesses to be more resilient amid climate change. So with this very simplified overview, my point is to show that design research can take many different forms and involve many different people. What's shared, however, are concerns regarding something being shaped with intention and purpose. So my research has focused on how public service systems, more specifically Norwegian child welfare, can be designed by the people within it. Together with people in this system, I've been exploring how it can be shaped through people adapting, how they relate in everyday situations. So to ground what I mean by such adaptations in everyday relations, I'll give you a short story from my prior work as a therapist, which I also opened the thesis with. The story is about my first client. He was a man in his 50s, and in his home country, he had once been a man of high status and reputation. Later, he had fled torture, imprisonment, and war. And now, when I met him, he felt socially downgraded as a refugee in a country that felt strange to him, and he struggled with what he had been through. Me, on the other side of the table, was 26, fresh out of my studies and supposed to help him. And believing I understood his needs, I offered him this evidence-based trauma treatment. And when I did so, he looked at me and said, well, you may know a lot from the books you've read, but there's also lessons I can teach you from my life. And the first is how undignifying it can feel for someone like me to need help from someone like you. So instead of following my plan, he suggested we'd leave the therapy room and take walks. In those walks, we would stop to drink tea and get to know each other. I reluctantly agreed, even though it went against the idea I had about what therapy was supposed to be. 2 months later, though, he said, now I can speak to you as someone I know. And then he told me his story, and we could start working through things together. So for me, this is a story of design. While we didn't use sticky notes or brainstormed, my client invited me to purposefully redesign what the service of therapy was, based on what was meaningful to him. And when I talk about people designing public service systems from within, this is an example of the kind of design I mean. A forum where not only clients and professionals, but also relatives, managers, and others involved shape how they are doing things together. And when many people do so, based on what's meaningful for them, my claim is that public service systems can evolve in meaningful ways through a form of ongoing collective designing. So in this trial lecture, the committee has given me 2 questions. The first is how this view of design relates to radical and incremental ideas of change. The second is about what this means for service design practice. I'll start by outlining how radical and incremental transformation are usually understood in service systems. Building on that, I'll complicate this binary from a relational perspective. And I'll argue that transformation is often relatively radical, meaning that large shifts rely on many interdependent small ones. These first 2 parts of the lecture address the first question. I'll then turn to what this means for design practice. Here, I'll begin by unpacking the public nature of public service systems. This, I'll argue, means designing them must be an ongoing and democratic effort. In this part of the lecture, I'll explore how such an effort can be enabled. And finally, I'll briefly consider what this approach means for how design is framed and organized in relation to the public sector. So let's start with how service system transformation is typically understood. In societies where labor and competencies are specialized, service systems play a central role in how we organize. So, for example, here you see a picture of my kids' school. How education is tied to the place and schedule of this school is central to how our community works. So its location and opening hours shape the everyday life of families like mine. And it influences our work patterns, the way we commute, activities in our neighborhood, and the rhythm of our community life. Given this central role of service systems in society, there is an increasing interest in how they can transform in response to challenges we are facing, like demographic shifts, rising polarization, and climate change. Calls are being made for these systems to be redesigned in a way that better address these crises, while promoting well-being and sustainable ways of living. This is reflected in the research on service design. So while most initial studies focused on improving customer experiences, the focus has now kind of gradually shifted into a focus on how these systems can be redesigned to support broader transformation. So what are service systems, and what does it mean to transform them? So in the research, an iceberg metaphor is often used to show that service systems include both visible and invisible elements. The visible elements refer to interactions and activity that people do to create some kind of value. So, for example, a patient describing their symptoms to get medical advice from their doctor. They also, however, include artifacts, built things, designed things, such as the waiting room chairs or the doctor's record system. These things we can see rests on what's known as, or labeled as, invisible social structures. So these structures refers to norms, assumptions, and beliefs that make some ways of doing things and making things appropriate and others not. So there are rules of the game, and these are often quite helpful, so we know how to do things together. So I don't usually take my doctor's chair when I enter the room or start writing the record myself in his record system. And when researchers when researchers talk about transformation, they often emphasize that change cannot just happen in these visible things. It also has to kind of change the underlying structures that make these sensible. So we're talking about a change below the surface. And I think this metaphor is quite helpful for thinking about incremental and radical change too. So the etymological meaning of incremental is something that increases. So from this, we can think about incremental changes as increasing the value of what already exists above the iceberg in this metaphor. So for example, that could be improving a doctor's record system so it becomes more efficient to use. The word radical, on the other hand, means relating to the root or ground. So radical changes in this way of thinking about it disrupt the existing norms, assumptions, and beliefs that are at the root of the iceberg, below the surface. And an example of this could be reframing what the medical record is as something kept and administered by patient, and thereby shifting who's the expert and who holds healthcare service. So this distinction aligns with research on public innovation. So here, incremental change refers to improving existing ways of doing things, while radical change offers something new by breaking with what is already possible. So the example of Norwegian public libraries can make this more concrete. Like in many countries, public libraries in Norway have played an important role in enabling democratic participation. When Norway gained full independence and introduced voting rights for everyone about 100 years ago, libraries' role was to ensure that everyone, or like the public as a whole, had access to information. And this photo shows my local library in Oslo 50 years ago. In this period, libraries were these quiet spaces for focused reading, and librarians were custodians of books and information. So today, general access to information has made this kind of custodianship less central. So while book loans have declined, social fragmentation and also diversity have increased. And as a result, libraries have needed to shift and transform to remain valuable in democracy. So today, people gather and speak in public libraries that used to be silent. The norms in these spaces have been radically disrupted, and so have the roles. So librarians work not just as custodians anymore, but as connectors, facilitating activities for public dialogue across people, communities, and generations. So when looking at the change in these libraries, we can consider how radical it was in terms of how much it disrupted previous norms and assumptions in the system. However, to understand the degree of this as a radical change, we also need at least two more dimensions. So the first is scope, which refers to how widespread the change is. The more librarians that changes their practices, the wider the scope of the change. The second is endurance, or how persistent the change is. So even if many libraries change, this can be a trend where new practices fade away after some time. So together, these three dimensions create a space in which we can consider to what degree a change in the system is large or small. So in design, these ideas of systems change have been taken up in strategies as what's known as scaling. If what's being designed is, for instance, a new program, scaling deep aims to ensure that the program changes the norms, assumptions, and beliefs of the system. Scaling out aims to increase the scope of change by replicating the program across many sites and places. And scaling up involves shifting laws or policies to help long-term implementation of it. However, this idea of scaling builds also on the assumption that something is being expanded or advanced. So that change happens through designing first and then spreading it after. And when looking closer at processes of change, it's possible to question that logic. So let's turn back to the example of libraries. Zooming in on the process shows how a quite big change was achieved through many small ones. So for instance, the first language cafe, something you now find in most libraries, emerged from these unorganized gatherings between immigrants and non-immigrants in library spaces. Some time ago at my local library, they started inviting authors of children's books every Saturday. This led to many local families starting to use the library as a meeting point in weekends. And at a certain point, the library also tested extended opening hours. And this later led to an app that all Oslo residents now can use to access most libraries until 11 in the evening. So my point is that these and many other small changes have gradually contributed to what can be seen as a radical change in what libraries are and how we think about them. So how can we understand the connection between these small and large changes? I'll now outline a relational perspective on how social systems transform. And for me, this perspective helps bridge this divide. The core of a relational view on systems was captured by Marx, who stated that society does not consist of individuals, but expressed the sum of interrelations, the relations within which these individuals stand. So in other words, a relational perspective brings relations to the foreground and entities or individuals to the back. Agirelm Paulsen's work on relational qualities is an inspiring example of how this focus has been brought into design. So instead of focusing mainly on who was involved when trying to understand public service systems, they invited participants to use different materials to represent the relations among these people, for instance using wool yarn to represent warm qualities and metal wire to represent cold ones. In my research, I've taken a relational perspective by drawing on 3 theoretical inputs. First, I've used service ecosystem design to see systems change as something that happens when people reshape the dominant norms, assumptions, and beliefs in service systems. This aligns with how I've already described systems change. It sees design as a collective process that everyone take parts in, but however, it says less about the dynamic in how this process unfolds. So to clarify those dynamics, I turned to 2 other fields. The first is relational construction, and the second is relational sociology. So relational construction emphasizes that what we see as true or right, or even how we identify as individuals, is shaped in our significant relations with others. So when we interact, we make sense of our worlds and negotiate meaningful ways of seeing things. So what it means to be a therapist, for example, is negotiated in relation to clients and also managers and co-workers. From this view, people and their actions are entangled and mutually dependent. So what it means to be a therapist depends on what it means to be a client, and so forth. At the same time, because people are in many different relationships and carry also histories with them, they relate across difference. So we are not the same even though we are relating. So if we go back to the story from my early work as a therapist, my client and I brought very different backgrounds into that situation. Our expectations of how to do things together did not fit. So together we had to improvise and figure out how to do things differently. And through that process, my ideas of what therapy could be changed, and maybe his did too. So in this way, relations between different people becomes generative spaces. So I see them as sites where taken for granted ways of thinking and doing can be disrupted, and openings for thinking, seeing, and doing otherwise can be created. Relational sociology offers a way to understand how these small disruptions and creations can lead to systems change. So from this perspective, social systems are webs of relations, and the system's characteristics depend on the patterns in that web. So for example, the system of higher education can be understood through the patterns in how we relate now. Some of our relations are about support, others are about peer learning, and others are about evaluation. And all of these are ingredients in higher education. So importantly, relations are not only direct, like we are interacting now and facing each other. They are also indirect, and these indirect relations mediate each other. So right now, for example, Our interaction is mediated by people we cannot see, like those who decides that the doctoral degree in Norway requires giving a trial lecture. And so we're entangled in these webs of relations that both enable and constrain how we interact. And most of the time, they stabilize each other. So because how others do things, there are certain things we can do and certain things we cannot do. But sometimes when people start relating in new ways in one part of the system, it opens possibilities for others to do so in other places. So from these openings, new relations can emerge, new ways of doing things, and when they take hold, they can shift system patterns from within. So I think this relational perspective provides an understanding of system change that is different than from the one depending on a radical disruption being scaled up or out. It suggests that these small, maybe sometimes not so radical changes can also create openings that create new openings for people to do things differently. So this process can, through this process, system can also change radically from within. And as such, what seems radical in hindsight often unfolds through what looks like everyday small interactions. So what I'm trying to do here is to open up or to open an idea that opens for a relatively radical approach to how we go about systems change, one focused on enabling these relational openings for change rather than scaling solutions. However, these processes don't happen on their own, and given the real-world politics and complexities of public service systems, it's easy to dismiss this as a naive and theoretical understanding. So in other words, relatively radical systems change needs to be practically enabled. So I'll now turn my attention to what this means for how we think about designing public service systems. Whoop, I had... But as a bridge into thinking about design's role in these processes, I want to take a short detour to consider what public service systems actually are. Earlier, I emphasized that design involves intention. So it's not random. It's action directed toward a purpose. But this raises an important question. So whose intention and what purpose should guide the direction of change in these public systems? For me, some 100-year-old ideas from the pragmatist philosopher John Dewey are helpful here. While his theories on inquiry, practice, and aesthetics have long influenced design research, his view on publics has also recently gained traction. So Dewey shows how a relational perspective gives rise to what we can see as consequential publics. I'll explain. So in the relations we are a part of, we are interdependent. The actions of some produce indirect consequences for others. Dewey sees publics as all those affected by these consequences to such a degree that they find it necessary to collectively care for them. So in other words, publics form to communicate, interpret, and respond to something they experience collectively. So that something can be consequences that is worth maintaining, such as a cultural practice, or a shared problem that they need to address, like harm to children. However, this view, thinking about publics in this way, also challenges the state logics that treats public service systems as originating in these centralized government bodies. So when publics work to manage the consequences they experience, for example, harm to children, their effort often over time becomes like professional practices, laws, and policies. But, and governments usually coordinate these efforts, but at a more foundational level, public service systems like child welfare originate from these collective efforts to confront a shared problem. And to get into the implications of design, I think it helps to understand also the context of Dewey's argument. His ideas on publics was written as a response to ideas of Walter Lippmann. Lippmann argued that democracy was in bad shape and that existing institutions failed to make the public effective in dealing with its problems. While Dewey agreed with this, they had very different ideas about how to approach it. So Lippmann's solution was technocratic. He claimed that because society had become too complex for citizens to grasp, they needed experts, such as scientists and administrators, to lead way and take action. Dewey argued that people struggled to understand the complex problems they experienced, but he also argued that since they were the ones living with the consequences, experiencing them, they held forms of knowledge that experts didn't. For Dewey, the challenge was one of method. So from his perspective, people needed experts to help them inquire into, interpret, and also address the problems they were experiencing. So if they gained methods for doing this, Dewey argued we could have what he called creative democracies, where publics frame the problems they encounter, test responses, and through that shared process, keep learning about how to live together. So while this simplified version of a 100-year-old debate between political philosophers, I think it holds a normative tension that matters for design today. So in a way, it is easy to side with Lippmann's lack of faith in how effective democratic processes are, especially when we face complex problems like the climate crisis. However, I do side with Dewey in arguing that those affected by social systems should steer how they evolve. And so by drawing on Dewey here, and this relational perspective, I also take kind of a normative stance that design of these systems should be democratic. This means that the purpose, intention, and direction of change needs to sit with the evolving collective that is the public. It also means that we should not treat the design of these systems as a centralized activity done by a few. To paraphrase the definition from Simon on design I opened with, I think public service design must be this ongoing process where many take courses of action aimed at changing these existing situations they experience into preferred ones. So I see this as a living and messy process where people steer the direction in which the system grow through their ongoing and collective experimentation with it. But a critical question still remains on how to enable such a process in practice. And to address this question and the implications it has for design, I'll reflect on some of the learnings from what we've been doing what I've been doing together with others in the child welfare system. The research, which I'll tell more about and we'll discuss this afternoon, centered around a large child welfare agency where I was employed, and involved social workers, parents, managers, youth with lived experience, and foster parents from within the system. It also involved design practitioners such as master students, researchers, and professionals. To enable this collective and continual design process from within such systems as child welfare, I argue that one needs to build at least two key capacities. I also argue that when these capacities are strong, system can change in quite radical ways. So the first capacity is space for many to experiment with how to relate otherwise. The second is space for collective and reflexive learning from these experiments. And these capacities kind of mirror two mechanisms of evolution. So these everyday experiments act like small mutations that create possibilities. Reflexive learning acts like a selection process where existing practices are monitored, questioned, and people figure out the way forward together. So focusing on these capacities means building kind of evolutionary pathways for public systems to evolve, pathways that allow them to kind of take the direction based on the situations that people within them experience. And I'll start with some reflections on these everyday experiments. So enabling those matters for two reasons. First, if people do them as part of their everyday practices, they are responding to real-life situations and struggles. And second, they continually feed the system with a plural menu of approaches. So one reflection from our work in child welfare is that we need to nurture what I call a culture of small disruptions. If people are to experiment with new ways of being together, disrupting the usual way of doing things has to be acceptable and even encouraged. So in a high-stakes setting like child welfare, managers and leaders play a key role in nurturing such cultures. So here you see a panel discussion from a mock public defense where I presented this PhD to colleagues in the Child Welfare Service a few weeks ago. After I presented, the internal committee reflected on the research and what it had did, what kind of value it had. A key point was that it had made it less scary to test new ways of doing things and challenging old ones. And so the cultural outcome of experimentation was more important than the specific outcomes of the experiments themselves. However, I'm showing this picture because of a detail you might not have noticed. On the left-hand side here is Mira. Mira is here and she doesn't know that this is a slide. But she, along with other leaders in the organization, has played this key role in enabling such a cultural shift by actively showing that small disruptions are legitimate and valued. So in this mock defense, Mira acted as the master of ceremony. And for the occasion, she had made a cape, as she thought one should have as the master of ceremony. And she wore this cape throughout the staff meeting. Nobody had done that before, and with the cape she demonstrated what a kind of a different approach to public administration. So my point here is that this approach to public leadership involves these continuous small gestures that legitimize playing even in a serious and regulated setting like child welfare. The other enabler I want to emphasize is what I call equipping experimenters on the ground. While experimenting with relating otherwise is easy to talk about, people need tools to do it in practice. So in some of our work, we've explored how designerly competencies can help provide people on the ground with necessary equipment. So here, for instance, you see versions of a tool made by design student Benjamin and family therapist Caroline. This was created as a tool for families and therapists to actively shape the focus of therapy together. So over the course of the therapeutic process, the therapist and the family would use this tool to write down focuses together and then move the strings to increase the emphasis on some areas and reduce it on others. Its aim was to act as a device through which therapy could be designed iteratively by those involved, and depending on the shifting concerns they had throughout the therapy process. So this tool is one example of many we worked on. They were created with and for children, youth managers, supervisors, and caseworkers. So, and if we go back to Dewey's point about expertise and publics, I see these designerly approaches to enabling the collective and ongoing, these as designerly approaches to enabling the collective and ongoing design of many. So not by figuring out for people how they should relate and do things, but by equipping them to figure this out in changing real-life situations. In other contexts, this way of designing for others to design has been called meta-design. And I argue that working from this principle is important for professional designers and also design research when entering the public sector. So while everyday experimentation can supply these plural ways of doing things, a second capacity must also be present for systems to evolve. I call this space for collective reflexivity. In the last couple of years, reflexivity has gained attention in service design research. As we've talked about earlier, system change, and particularly radical ones, involve changes in the norms, assumptions, and beliefs of the system. Reflexivity refers to people's awareness of these structures and the way they guide how they act in the social systems they're part of. For designing, this awareness matters because it lets people do things differently than just acting out of habit. It's connected to their agency. However, reflexivity is often understood as these internal dialogues that enable us as individuals to take action. And if our aim is to enable collective design processes, an interesting question becomes how we can create space for shared conversations that make people able to renegotiate their entrenched norms, assumptions, and beliefs together. So much of our work in child welfare has been to making these conversations an ongoing practice. building on the capacity to keep questioning our entrenched ways of doing things. But that's been hard, because sustaining such a practice, critical practice, requires the very structures we wanted to question, to value the questioning itself. Through trying and failing with this tension for almost 2 years, we learned that collective reflexivity has to be perceived by people as a form of constructive disruption. Disruptive in the sense that people gain new perspectives, but constructive in the sense that these new perspectives, new ideas, and critical questions are not exaggerated in a way where they are shut down by the collective in the culture. So based on these learnings, we ended up designing what we called reflexive forums. In these forums, which are still ongoing, everyone in the Child Welfare Agency, 130 people, meet in groups every third week to discuss provocative statements about their shared norms, assumptions, and beliefs. So each forum follows a specific format designed to hold kind of constructive disruption. So participants craft provocations and participate in that. And then they alternate between listening to others, discussing them, and being part of that dialogue themselves. After a year, surveys showed that social workers experienced the organizational culture as more open to these reflexive dialogues. So while reflexive practices can be embedded inside the system, collective reflexivity can also be sparked from the margins. In one experiment, we collaborated with design students, theater students, and people with lived experience from child welfare. The experiment focused on sparking conversations about how family logics shape practices in child welfare. To do this, we staged a fictional political fair where politicians, played by theater actors, advocated for these different views on what constitutes a good family in conversations with participants. So here, for instance, you see the Volvo party advocating for a nuclear family fitting into a safe Scandinavian car with 2 seats in the front and 2.5 seats in the back. We also had other parties like the dyadic mother and child party and the village party, which represented this more extended logic of family and care, and the patriarchy, which you see here. After interacting with politicians and listening to a staged debate between them, all participants casted their vote for their preferred party. So while it all was quite humorous and exaggerated, we invited them to play with serious assumptions shaping the system. The Volvo party got 71% of the votes from the Child Welfare Agency. So I wouldn't treat this as rigid research data, but it did spark conversations across the organizations about how dominant views on family shapes practice. So for example, people began questioning how this nuclear logic made it seem natural to move children at risk from their own nuclear family into new nuclear foster homes when they were at risk of harm. So a year later, there was interest in exploring more network-based approaches to doing this. For instance, programs built on extended family logics where children and sometimes whole families are placed into networks of other families. So in this sense, the experiment kind of created a relatively radical opening. The questions it raised made room for imagining different ways forward, ways that could lead over time, meaningfully reshape how foster care is practiced. So from these practical experiments, I suggest that enabling ongoing collective and relatively radical forms of designing depends on building 2 collective capacities. First, people need space to experiment with relating otherwise, so a plural menu of possibilities can emerge. Second, people need space for reflexive dialogue, where they can negotiate both their current practices and the direction they want to move. And this approach, I argue, do differ from a system change model that design first and scales after. Instead, it offers a more democratic way of working, one that fits complex settings where you have to kind of stay open and responsive for new possibilities that emerge. However, I'm very aware that public managers, practitioners, and professional designers are all embedded in systems whose dynamic make an approach like the one I'm describing here easier said than done. We therefore need to make at least a last stop to consider some of the tensions that show up in the relation between design as a discipline and the public sector, where public service systems, at least in this context, are how they are most often organized. As these tensions are relational, I don't think they are anyone's fault. Rather, these tensions kind of generate questions, and that, I think, consistent with what I've argued for here, needs kind of collective attention and experimentation in our way forward. So the first tension I see is how design is often being reified and framed as a distinct thing in these settings. For instance, in a recent book, researchers critiqued projects funded through a design incentive program in Norway for rarely producing lasting implemented change. In the following debate, the program manager's response was, quote, "Service design works, but as with all methods, you have to do it right." And in a sense, both these arguments reflect the same underlying logic, that design is something discrete that can be applied correctly or incorrectly, and judged as effective or ineffective. So instead of staying with this framing, that I think don't necessarily enable these collective processes, I think we need to find ways for the public sectors to name and legitimize the forms of designing that are already happening, often under very different labels. Taking myself as an example, I believe public sector actors can learn a lot from how already existing practices shape systems, like their practice in shaping systems, by drawing on ideas and practices from the design discipline. But within the design discipline, we also need to experiment with enabling practices that open up rather than crowd out design under other names. In doing so, we should resist assuming that the design discipline brings superior approaches in these settings, but also learn from how other traditions navigate the politics, conflicts, and plurality that characterize these systems. The second tension I want to mention is how public service design is most often organized. In many public sector settings, service development is initiated as discrete projects. And professional designers are commissioned as externals, tasked with taking the lead on the most complex challenges. The effect is that design becomes something delivered from the outside rather than cultivated from within. So I think the public sector needs to experiment with organizing design as an ongoing part of everyday practice, rather than as something isolated in projects. This includes rethinking how external competencies are used, not as only short bursts or as expert problem solving, but as contributors to this more long-term capacity building. And within the design discipline, I think there is a need to explore business models and organizational forms that enable professional designers to build durable relationships and strengthen capacities over time. So this also means learning how to join design processes from within the public sector, rather than professional designers ending up as external change agents. The growing movement toward in-house design roles, at least that we have here in Norway, may offer an important lesson here. So for this lecture, I was given two questions. The first was how an approach that treats design as a collective ongoing process of local adaptation relates to radical and incremental change. In response, I suggested that it offers an alternative to the idea of scaling radical interventions. Instead, it focuses on creating multiple openings that can at times radically shift systems from within. I also argued that a relational view means that public service design must be a democratic process enacted by many, not a specialized approach carried out by a few. And that notion led me to the second question: what this understanding implies for service design practice. Here I argued that it points towards building capacities for experimentation and reflexivity. And finally, I sketched out a set of unresolved questions about how design is framed and organized in relation to the public sector. So this, in short, is my take on the questions I was asked to address. To round off, however, I want to make one final reflection. So in this lecture, I've talked about radical change. And in my dissertation, I don't use that word. I use the term generative. And for me, generative holds two things. It both involves challenging what is fixed and stable, but it also brings another quality, which is the capacity to open new alternatives for doing. So, and at a time of increasing polarization, loneliness, and consumption, a key assumption I think we need to ask generative questions about is the assumption of separateness. The idea that we are separate from one another, separate from the planet, and separate from the systems we inhabit. And so for me, a relational situated view offers a generative alternative, an alternative that opens up better possibilities for figuring out how to figure out things together. Thank you.